with you. From 5:30 to 7. Okay. Yeah. Good evening to everybody who's joined us today. A very warm welcome on the penultimate day of Tamil Heritage Trust's Indology Festival, titled Wanderers and Witnesses, Travelers' Tales of India. Over the last 4 days and 8 lectures, we have traveled along with some of the important explorers, chroniclers, and spiritual seekers who ventured into our subcontinent, leaving behind their own unique imprint of their observations and interpretations. The real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes, said Marcel Proust. Today, we seek to look at India through the eyes of 3 unique travelers who, through their fresh perspectives, portray a land not just of trade and empire, but a space of deep cross-cultural interconnections and personal transformation. First, we have Afanasy Nikitin, a Russian merchant from 15th century, who when he traveled to India, actually traveled far beyond his familiar territory. His account, Voyage Beyond the Three Seas, is one of the earliest by a European about India and is deeply introspective, often conflicting, and rich in detail about the religious practices and societal customs of India at that time. Carsten Niebuhr was a German scholar from 18th century who was part of the Danish-Arabian expedition. His maps, surveys, and detailed travel accounts are considered to be invaluable for their scientific rigor and human curiosity. Though his observations on Indian society are brief, they are important for the empirical clarity and the deep respect that he showed towards another culture. The last voice that we'll be hearing today is that of Henrietta Clive. Through her letters and diary from a colonial era, she paints a deeply personal and gendered perspective of life in India at that time. Through her botanical interests and the vivid picture that she paints of the landscape and domestic life in India at that time, we get a rather nuanced, subtle, and layered understanding of the exchanges between British and Indians at that time. These 3 travelers, through their varied experiences, that is mercantile, scholarly, and domestic, give us unique eyes to look at India. And when we reflect on their narratives, we understand the different ways of observing, studying, questioning, and interpreting a new country or a new culture. And what we gain here is not just knowledge, but a very deep appreciation of the power of travel. Travel across geography and continents, travel across cultures and languages, and travel across centuries. Before we begin today's exploration, let me give you a brief introduction to Tamil Heritage Trust, which is our organization. Tamil Heritage Trust or Tamil Paramparya Arakattalai is a voluntary organization started almost 15 years back by a group of like-minded people with the objective of understanding, appreciating, disseminating, and celebrating information related to India's history and heritage, not just for the scholarly and academically inclined, but for the average enthusiastic public as well. Towards this end, THT conducts various programs and initiatives throughout the year. Chief amongst these are our talks and seminars. Our most important program is our monthly talk series conducted on the first Saturday of every month. This is an online talk in English. We are extremely proud to say that we have conducted this program almost uninterrupted for 15 years now. We merely changed the format from in-person talks to online through and post-Corona. Then in December, we have an in-person event across 2 days, which we call as the Pechu Kacheri or the Oratory Concert, to collaborate and coincide with the Margari Isai Kacheris of Chennai. Then we have our most scholarly and erudite event, the Indology Festival. And as I already mentioned, we are on the penultimate day of that. Apart from our talks and seminars at THT, we also conduct various workshops and classroom sessions from time to time, where anybody can join and participate. Our workshops are one day long and called How to See a Temple, How to See a Museum, etc. Classroom sessions are on a variety of topics like Pallava Grantham script, ancient Indian astronomy, ancient Indian mathematics, etc. Alamar Avai, the other initiative of ours, is essentially meant for the school teachers of Tamil Nadu. Over a series of weekend lectures, aspects of Indian history and heritage are discussed, the idea being that these teachers take it back to their students, thus further spreading awareness. Docent training is a more recent initiative of ours, where a training is given for preparing docents who can present historical sites and heritage monuments in a professional manner to the enthusiastic audience. Version 2 of this training was completed only earlier this year, and we'll soon be advertising for version 3. Site seminar is another activity of ours, which is in-house, largely meant for our own self-education and self-enhancement. Zeroing in on a particular site in India, our volunteers study the same in depth over several weeks and share that information among the group through several in-house seminars. Then, armed with all this information, we visit the site and experience it in its totality. From the Tamil Heritage Trust, we have also instituted 2 awards for individual contributions. The first such award is named after our founder and called Professor S. Swaminathan Heritage Award. This is given for individual contributions in the field of Indian history and heritage. We will soon be calling for nominations for this award for the year 2025. The other award that we give is called V. Venkaya Epigraphy Award and is given for individual contributions in the field of Indian epigraphy. It's named after V. Venkaya, who was the first official Indian epigraphist and instituted by his great-granddaughter, Miss Sunita Madhavan. THT has been entrusted with the responsibility of administering this award. This year, our nominations for this award have already been received, and we are in the process of jury scrutiny. We have a YouTube channel where you will find links to all our past talks right down to today. Kindly subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon to receive notifications of future events. These are our social media handles. This is our mailing address. You can mail us here to join our mailing list, or if you want to join any of our activities in a voluntary capacity. As already mentioned, we are a voluntary organization. We don't have any dedicated financial backing. So any kind of financial contributions are welcome. You may use this QR code or address to contribute generously, and it will be deeply appreciated. That, in effect, was about Tamil Heritage Trust. Now, moving on to today's programs, we have 2 talks lined up for you today. The first talk is called A Tale of Two Travelers, Afanasy Nikitin and Carsten Niebuhr, and will be delivered by Dr. Kurush Dalal. The second talk is called Phone St. George to Srirangapatna, Lady Clive's Journey, 1800, and will be delivered by Dr. Jennifer Hose. Moving to the first talk. Afanasy Nikitin was a Russian merchant and adventurer from Tver, the first Russian and one of the earliest Europeans to travel to and document his visit to India in a narrative titled A Journey Beyond the Three Seas. In the spring of 1471, Nikitin sailed for India from Hormuz, and arriving in the port of Chau, Nikitin observed the markets, lifestyles, and courts of the Bahmani Sultanate and the Vijayanagar Empire. He visited the Hindu sanctuary of Parvattum, which he called the Jerusalem of the Hindus. He spent almost 3 years in India before returning to Russia. Carsten Niebuhr, a German mathematician, cartographer, scholar, and explorer, was the sole survivor of a Danish expedition to the Middle East and India. He spent 14 months in India, primarily in Bombay and Surat. He is known for his detailed accounts of these places with valuable insights into their economics and social dynamics, as well as his accurate maps and other sketches. In his talk, Dr. Dalal will be highlighting the fact that these two travelers lived two completely separate lives, separated not just by origin, but also by time. Yet, among their many, many differences, we also see amazing and interesting similarities. A little bit about Dalal. A former director, School of Archaeology, Institution Trust, Mumbai, Dr. Kurush F. Dalal obtained his PhD on the early Iron Age in Rajasthan. Subsequently, he shifted focus to the early medieval period on the west coast of India and excavated the sites of Sanjan, Chandor, Chandan, Sanjan, Chandor, and Mandad, having a strong impact on scholarship in that region. His interests and research include memorial stones and asker stones in India, numismatics, defense archaeology, architecture, and ethnoarchaeology, and allied disciplines. He is the co-director of the Salsit Explorations Project, a massive urban archaeology project documenting the archaeology of Mumbai since 2015. Apart from being a prolific author, speaker, and mentor, he also researches into the connections between history, archaeology, and culinary anthropology through his workshops and food walks. A very warm welcome to you, Dr. Dalal. I invite you to now take over the stage and deliver your lecture.
Thank you very much, ma'am. It's incredibly kind of you to have me here, and very gracious introduction from you. Thank you very, very much. To all the members of the Tamil Heritage Trust, thank you for reposing your faith in me. To Ramesh, who was kind enough to recommend my name. Thank you again. And of course, to Riddhi Joshi, who first talked to me about the Tamil Heritage Trust. I can't really start without thanking all of these people. In my opening notes, all I can say is that Nikitin I've known about for a lot of years, though most Indians don't. Niebuhr I only knew in passing, thanks to his maps. When Ramesh asked me to do this lecture today, and he said, can you do one of them? And I said, why not both? I should have realized that when he said, can you do one? I should have perhaps stuck to one. It was a great joy going back to Nikitin and going forward to Niebuhr. And I spent quite a lot of time reading their story in their words. And I've realized that most of what has been spoken about them since is unnecessary, more or less, especially in print, because everything that they had to say, they said themselves. So, or almost everything. So on that happy note, I think I will share my PPT and not waste the precious time of the speakers here, and thank the speakers and again the Tamil Heritage Trust for having me. And well, let's talk about a tale of two travelers, Nikitin and Niebuhr. Afanasy Nikitin's birth we have no clue about. We know he died in 1475. He was a very, very interesting and very, very intriguing personality at a time when few such people have been known anywhere in the world. Nikitin was basically the son of a trader. He was also known as Athanasius Nikitin, not just Afanasy Nikitin. He was a merchant from the city of Tver, and he was born sometime in the early half, well, probably the first decade, the first few decades of the 15th century AD. Now, Tver was a very interesting Russian principality. It existed between the 13th and the 15th centuries AD, more or less independently. The Principality of Tver had its capital at Tver, as you can see over here right in the center. And this is the shape of the principality. You have the Volga running through it. And the most important thing that you have to know about the Principality of Tver is that it was at a massive conjunction. Three major rivers came together over here. And this is what made this an incredibly important trading settlement. It was a very important trading town and had existed probably from the 10th century AD, most definitely a very important trading station from the 12th century AD onwards. During the 14th century, Tver actually rivaled the Principality of Moscow and, well, might have ended up being the capital of the USSR had things gone slightly differently. It ultimately became the center of the unified Russian state and then decayed, and by 1485 was annexed in turn by Moscow. It's a beautiful city, and the confluence of the Volga and the Tvetsa rivers, basically, and a smaller rivulet that joins in. From here, the Volga is navigable all the way down to the Caspian Sea. And as we'll see in maps in a bit, these rivers coming in together over here and by basically bifurcating the town. The Tmaka is there, the Tvetsa is there, and of course the Volga. And these rivers brought enormous amounts of goods with them. Even rivers that were not navigable were very important because they gave you a permanent source of water and they created a kind of parallel road system next to them. So you followed the river, and by doing so, you, well, were part of the riverine trade. Tver rose to prominence during the Great War between the Grand Duchy of Moscow and had massive defensive alliances with Lithuania, Novgorod, Byzantium, and also the Golden Horde, interestingly. Boris of Tver sent one of his men, Afanasy Nikitin, to search for gold and diamonds as far as India. So it was the ruler of Tver who sent Nikitin off. Nikitin left somewhere between 1466 and 1468. Some people believe he returned by 1472, but as you will see, it's quite clear that he only came back in 1475. He was one of the first Indian account writers, the first writers of what India was like as far as the West was concerned, and definitely as far as Russia was concerned. So the entire Russian world that existed at that time, you know, the breakup of the Kievan Rus, the various states, the Lithuanian lords, and, well, the Poles doing their bit on the other side, the various smaller states in the region of the Volga, etc. Uh, these people had a lot of texts, but most of these were religious texts. Most writers at this time wrote religious texts. Very, very few of them really wrote a travelogue, and nobody had ever been all the way to India and written a travelogue about it. All the knowledge they had of India at that time was second-hand or third-hand or purely hearsay. Ultimately, it was only in the 20th century that his contributions were truly understood, and a beautiful set of monuments were opened. The Volga Embankment in 1955 in Tver. This is that amazing monument that was erected to Afanasy Nikitin. We don't really know what he looked like. We have no clue whether he was truly such a warrior figure or not. But, well, it's a great monument nonetheless. This is a map of the Volga. This is the Caspian Sea in the bottom over here. I'll try and see if I can get uh, I can't for the love of me seem to find out. But if you can see my cursor right at the, if you see the image on the left-hand side, right on its right-hand bottom is the Caspian Sea. And you have the delta of the Volga and the Volga going up all the way over here. This is one of the great highways of medieval Russia. And this is where Tver is located. If you see a close-up, this is Tver here. And this is the Volga coming in all the way to Tver over here. So it was a very, very important river. It was a very, very important trading river. And this was what the city of Tver looked like. And this was how the two rivers basically divided the city and created three very interesting quarters during that period. This is a map of Afanasy Nikitin's great journey, the journey beyond the three seas. as he calls it, which was without any doubt the first Russian literary work to talk about a strictly commercial, non-religious trip. This was not a trip going out on, to the Holy Land or on a trip around a large number of different important religious locations. We were not looking at wars being fought against each other. This was actually a man going out for commerce and his observations of the people around them. He was a very well educated man, and that's very, 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 very obvious to us from his writings. He visited the Caucasus, Persia, India, and the Crimea. Most of his notes are dedicated to India, to its political structure, to its trade, to its agriculture, to its customs, to its ceremonies. He actually uses the titles of various people and not just their names. They were not known by their names in their day and age, but they were known by their titles. There are a lot of digressions. There are autobiographical passages. There's a lot of despair that he feels at various times. And all of this makes his work truly a human work. I mean, I can't say anything more than that. So there's a strong individual authorial presence. And the last page, sadly, is not really written by him. It's got Turkic and some Arabic. Uh, they're very typical Muslim prayers. A lot of people say this indicates that Nikitin might have converted to Islam when he was in India, but this is absolute rubbish. His journey lasted 8 years from 1466 to 1475. He started out from Tver, but he didn't make it all the way back home. This is one of the actual pages of his manuscript. He starts off by saying that it was an incredibly sinful journey for a devout Orthodox Christian belonging to Russian Orthodoxy, going to a land full of Muslims, and then even worse, as far as he was concerned, going to a land full of non-Abrahamic peoples who worship multiple gods was an absolute and completely shocking thing to do. He undertook this between three seas, the Sea of Derbent, also known as the Sea of Khalis, which is basically the Caspian Sea, the Sea of Hindustan, which is the Arabian Sea, and the Black Sea or the Sea of Stambul. He first went down the Volga, the Caspian Sea, and along with him was a very interesting character who actually played a very important role towards the end of his journey once again. He was an ambassador of the Shirvan Shah. The Shirvan Shahs were a very interesting dynasty. We'll have a look at them. And their ambassador to the court of Tver, Hassan Beg. He made it down with Hassan Beg all the way to the mouth of the Volga when they were robbed. Everything that they had was taken from them. They were virtually cast away. They tried to fight the pirates. They killed a few of them, but to no avail. Finally, he went to the western shore of the Caspian and went on to Baku, to the Shirvanshahs. He saw the Eternal Fire Temple, as it's called, went from here to Sari in the Mazandaran province at the southern shores of the Caspian. And what is fascinating is he begged the Shirvanshah to make restitution to him for what had happened at the end of the Volga by the Tatars over there. The Shirvanshah was very, very happy to help him out, especially when Hassan Beg came and spoke for him, but there was no restitution of his property or anything else. Now, the Shirvanshahs ruled from 861 to 1583. This makes them one of the most enduring dynasties of the Islamic world. This is actually the palace at Baku, which Afanasy Nikitin would have visited, the 15th century AD palace of the Shirvanshahs. This is the mausoleum on the left-hand side, a very, very beautiful building, and the famous Kekubad Mosque. Luckily, there are earlier pictures of it. Most of it was completely destroyed later on in an earthquake, and there is all that is left of it on the bottom center. This is the Eternal Fireplace, or the Yanar Dag, as it's sometimes known. There are a lot of places where gas escapes in this region, and the ancient Zoroastrians thought this was very, very important to them, especially as fire was a great symbol of their faith. Surprisingly, from this great fireplace of the Zoroastrians, he went to the great mountain of the Zoroastrians via Amul. He went from Amul to Demavan, probably considered the most sacred uh, mountainous site in the whole of Zoroastrianism, where the Zoroastrians believe the future savior of Zoroastrianism will come from. From here, he went to Rai and then to Kashan, which is famous for the Kashan lusterware, to Nain, Yazd, Sirjan, and Tarum. Finally, from there to Lar and then to Bandar Hormuz. So, Bandar was the name of the port that was otherwise known to us as Hormuz. This is not the same Hormuz as we have today, but a little north of it. Hormuz has been continuously moving south as siltation increases in the mouth of the port. He sailed from here to Muscat, took a dhow to Dega, which is probably due, and finally landed at mainland India at Khambat. This is Sirjan, originally known as Shirgan, a very historical city in Iran, uh, goes back all the way to the Sasanian era, and it was very, very important for a period of about over 1,000 years. On the right hand side is an image of a Muscat Dhao or an Omani Dhao, as it's called. And the Omanis were great sailors. They had an empire that stretched all the way to Africa. There's a beautiful painting of the same kind of Dhao that you can see on the left hand side in a much earlier manuscript. Today, of course, these Dhaos are powered by motors, motorized engines, and rarely use their sails at all. But they originally all used lateen sails, which were used all over the Arabian Sea. This is the map of the Gulf of Cambay, giving you an idea of how dangerous it was to traverse this Gulf. Massive sandbars and beaches that have kept moving to and fro. This is actually a British Admiralty map, but much earlier than this, we have movements. And there would be pilots that would take you up to Khambat, which is right at the top in the center of the map. Khambat was a very important port. A vast amount of carnelian was turned into all kinds of beads and shipped out from here. Along with that, indigo and lac. And this is a beautiful European painting of the city of Khambat with the ships all stacked up in the port. Nikitin reached Cambay when it was ruled by the Ahmedabad-based Gujarat Sultans. Their reign lasted roughly from 1407 to 1572, so he was smack bang in the middle of this during their heyday. He talks about how it was a huge market, and he gives us many details about the indigo and the lac that was sent out from here. Khambat was very, very famous for its export of cloths, and various different kinds of cloth dyed, especially using this beautiful indigo blue, have been found all over the Islamic world. We have large fragments of them from the city of Fustat in Egypt, to give you an example. From here, he took another ship and reached Chaul, about 100 kilometers south of Bombay, on the seventh week after Easter. It took him 6 weeks from Cambay to Chaul. It shouldn't have. In his own writings, he says a ship can go there in 10 days, but it took this time because obviously the ship he was on was going from port to port to port. The first thing that shocked and knocked his socks off was that India was a land where everyone went naked. Now, over here by naked, he means upper body nudity, which to somebody who was an Orthodox Christian and had just gone through an Islamic series of Islamic lands was absolutely flabbergasting. He observed that India was a land where everyone went naked. So, which means everyone was more or less topless. And the women went with their heads uncovered, which was shocking to him. As I said, he'd come from Islamic lands where women covered themselves in their entirety, especially the heads, and from Russia, which had very, very similar head covering for all women. They wore one single plait running down the back of their oiled heads. And he also goes on to tell us that they had roughly one child every year, and children were not clothed till they were at least 7 years of age and ran around naked in the streets. He, of course, was followed everywhere by a large gaggle of children and other people who were shocked to see this absolutely white man. By this time, he was probably a lovely lobster color, but never mind that. Nikitin mentions this, that he was quite a spectacle and that he was followed everywhere. He talks about the people, he talks about their clothing, he talks about their food, and he uses the word loincloth or dhoti. Okay, and in a very interesting way, he said they wore one cloth around their waists, one cloth around their heads, and another on their shoulders. So he's basically talking about a turban, a dhoti, and an angavastram. And to him, they're all just large sheets of cloth that they're wearing. He goes on to tell us about the soldiers that are there, and in great detail that all the warriors carry swords and shields. Some have spears, knives, sabers, bows, and arrows. He talks about the women going bare-breasted. It's something that comes up 2 or 3 times, and then goes on to say that everybody goes barefoot. After being in Chaul for some time, Nikitin then ended up traveling overland to Junar to meet Asad Khan, the officer for the Malik at Tujar. Basically, Muhammad Gawan, this was Muhammad Gawan's title. He stayed for 2 months with Asad Khan. He says it was the planting season, the monsoons. Uh, Farmers are planting wheat, rice, pulses, and other foods. Uh, we're not very sure about how good his observations were because wheat is something that would not usually be planted in the monsoons. He says wine was made from big coconuts and beer from tanta. So we believe this tanta is a word for one of the various different millets which was being used to make beer. He observes that horses were fed a khichdi with pulses, probably horse gram pullet, and jaggery and ghee, and that there were no locally bred horses, but only oxen and buffaloes. Now, this is something that we've been saying for the longest time ever in history and archaeology, that India is not conducive to horses and that horses have continuously been imported into the country. It's only ponies that are bred and used by nomadic tribes. Horses have always had to be imported. He was treated rather badly by Asad Khan. He'd bought himself a beautiful horse in Chaul, and Asad Khan immediately coveted this horse and confiscated it casually. Then he demanded a huge ransom for the horse by saying that he was a non believer who had brought this horse and therefore insulted Asad Khan. And on Christmas, that's Orthodox Christmas, of course, Khoja Muhammad of Khorasan arrived at Junnar. Now, Khoja Muhammad was somebody who uh, Nikitin knew and Nikitin had met in his travels in Persia. So Nikitin begged him to intercede. He was given back his horse, but a lot of his things were not given back to him. He was convinced this was some sort of a Christmas miracle. To add to this, he was most shocked when he was told that there were no goods that he could ship back to Russia via Hormuz because he was not an Indian and he was not an Arab and he was not a Muslim, and therefore there were massive taxes on any non Muslim, non Indian to export anything from India outside India. Uh, Nikitin was very, very upset about this. I mean, he'd come here to talk about trade and to take gold and jewels and things like that back. And here he was categorically being told it was not possible. He was also told about myriad pagan pirates, or rather Hindu pirates, who worship stone idols and frequented the waters, saying that, if you try to bypass us and you fall foul of these pirates, that won't be our fault. He was very, very disgusted at what was happening and he decided to go to the capital and find out whether he could talk directly to the Sultan to see whether something could be done. He left Junnar for Bidar, which was at that point the capital of the Bahmani Sultanate, and much to his relief, from there to Kalimgar and finally to Gulbarga. So, Gulbarga was the earlier capital of the Bahmani Sultanate, and then it shifted briefly to Bidar during the time of Muhammad Gawan. He was much, much surprised that there was not really anything worth buying for him. There was nothing of value for the merchants and princes of Twer. There was nothing that was available here that really would have worked as trade goods. He talks in detail about the armored elephants who had massive beaten iron swords strapped to their tusks, steel body armor, iron and steel body armor, huge howdahs on top, with 12 men bearing guns and arrows. The word he uses is cannons. So these would have been uh, small arms of that period, perhaps 1 pounder or smaller. This is very, very important because this is the earliest mention of gunpowder weapons in India. Uh, what we know traditionally is that gunpowder weapons only came to India with Babur, and it was Babur who brought them to the Battle of Panipat, and that's when they were first used in India. Uh, the fact that they were there at least, let's say, 50 years before Babur, more than 50 years before Babur in the Deccan, says a lot, and we really need to look at this in greater detail. He then goes to talk about mythical birds that exist, mythical animals, and a prince of the monkeys who has a huge army, and that if anybody is not kind to monkeys, then the prince of the monkeys descends with his army of enormous numbers and completely destroys the place from whence the person has come who has hurt or insulted the monkeys. He calls Bidar the capital of Muslim Hindustan. Now, this is a bit of a hyperbole. It was the temporary capital of uh, our good friends, uh, the Sultanate, and this was towards the end of the Sultanate period. In any case, uh, Muhammad Gawan was desperately bringing it together. Uh, he talks about the young Sultan and his Khorasani nobles, talks about Malik at-Tujar, basically Muhammad Gawan, who had an army of 200,000 men, Malik Khan, who had 100,000, and Farhad Khan, who had 20,000. And he said that the Sultan went to war with an army of at least 300,000 men. He talks in detail about the palace at Bidar, describing it, and is very, very impressed by its absolute beauty, its fountains, its hallways, its hangings, so on and so forth. He finally sells his horse here because he's running out of money, and he introduces himself as a Christian. He also uses a local name. And this is one of the very interesting things that he does. He realizes that Afanasy Nikitin or Athanasius Nikitin is not working at all. So he calls himself Khoja Yusuf Khorasani. Okay. And this makes him more acceptable. He mentions the vegetarianism of India and Indians in great detail. He talks about how Hindus and Muslims do not eat together, especially being the Hindus not eating with the Muslims because they would lose caste, faith, etc. Very specifically notices that only the right hand is used to eat food, and that Indians refuse to use forks or spoons to put food into their mouths. They only use spoons and things like implements to cook with, not to eat with. They eat a lot of khichdi, according to him, with ghee and vegetables cooked in ghee or milk. Now, this is a very interesting take about the vegetables being cooked in milk, not something that we really see popularly today. He talks about the West Coast. He mentions the various ports, the West Coast, all the way from Khambat to Dabhol. He talks about the different timings of passage between these ports. And he says that Dabhol, which was the Bijapur port, was the last Muslim harbor in India. This is very interesting because he landed at what was Ahmednagar, which when the Bahmani Sultanate collapsed would become the Ahmednagar port. And he then talks about Dabhol, from where he finally leaves India one day, as the last Muslim port, which becomes the Bijapur port. This is what is left today of the palace at Bidar. It's an absolutely spectacular palace. We have Muhammad Gawan's madrasa, we have the mosque in Muhammad Gawan's madrasa, and this was definitely up and in its absolute glory when Nikitin was here. He talks to us about a vast range of goods from various ports and areas in southern India. And there's a huge list about what is being shipped out of the south and in which direction. So he talks about goods being shipped to Pegu, Burma, to Sri Lanka and China. And he then gets into a lot of recrimination, and he says that this was his fourth Easter away from home in Bidar, and that he had absolutely nothing to show about it, and that was roughly about uh, somewhere between 1470 and 1472 at this time. And he just felt that he'd absolutely achieved no single purpose, not realizing that documenting all of these things was the greatest purpose that he could have put his life to. and that has been his legacy to this very day. So the Bahmani Sultan, uh, Suleiman III, and At-Tujar or Muhammad Gawan led a huge host against Vijayanagar at this time, but after taking a single town, they were routed by the Vijayanagar Empire. The emperor at that time was Virupaksha Raya II, and in 1465 he was succeeded by his uncle Mallikarjuna Raya, which brought an entire end to that dynasty. This is a Tamil inscription on the right hand side found over there by Virupaksha Raya II. Uh, there was a lot of warfare up and down in this region, and Virupaksha Raya lost the entire Konkan coast, Goa, Chaul, Dabul, and all of that by 1470. Whatever control he had on the coast was completely taken away by the Bahmanis, and Muhammad Gawan actually seemed to be reconsolidating the entire empire of the Bahmanis. Uh, so Sultan, sorry, not Suleiman Shah, Muhammad Shah III, the Bahmani Sultan also invaded the Doab of the Krishna and the Tungabhadra, and Raja Purushottama Gajapati of Odisha said chance pe dance and invaded Tiruvannamalai. So the massive Vijayanagar Empire was now beset on all sides. Nikitin tells us in great detail about the city of Vijayanagar. He never went there. Uh, this is a very interesting thing about his observations from his discussions with various people. Sadly, a lot of people who talk about Nikitin said he went to Vijayanagar, which is wrong. Vijayanagar is very categorically never said he visited. This on your right hand side is a map of Hampi. A lot of work has been done here. He said it's a massive city surrounded by three moats and that a river flows through it. He's basically talking about the Tungabhadra and how the city actually existed on both sides of the Tungabhadra. He talks in detail about how there is a wild jungle on one side and that the other has a beautiful valley, which is good for, well, anything, as he says. Um, there's what he means over here is that it's a very, very agriculturally rich area. There is a massive forest for a lot of forest produce, and this is basically the target of the Sultanate, though the Sultanate hasn't managed to do anything about it. Uh, he goes down to Gulbarga and he decides to leave for home. He travels to Kulur, which may be Kolar, where he says he sees hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, that is again a bit of an exaggeration, digging for cornelian and diamonds. Now, carnelians and diamonds don't usually get found together. So, again, this is a bit of a complication. And he then tells us about the port of Dabhol, about how Dabhol was one of the greatest ports that he'd seen. And there were a large number of Ethiopians who were coming to trade at Dabhol. Now, whether these were actually Ethiopians or there were Arabs from Africa, Ethiopians, and other Africans is a little difficult to ascertain. But we know that at this time there was a lot of Ethiopian traffic into these regions. Sadly, we don't really have much evidence for the same on the ground. So, again, Nikitin becomes a very, very important source for this. He tells us about all the goods coming here and going from here. He tells us about the wild elephants and how they're tamed by the Vijayanagar peoples, and how Vijayanagar uses more elephants in battle than the Bahmani Sultanate, and that is what is holding, well, the empire together. He finally takes a ship back home from here. He is a sad, depressed, and dejected man who has realized that his entire journey has been to no avail. Um, After a few months of the siege of Vijayanagar, the Sultanate army takes a lot of people hostage, sells off a lot of slaves, and Nikitin is not very happy to see what is happening over here. He decides to go back home. He makes it back to Muscat on his sixth Easter away from home. So this would be somewhere in 1472 or 1475 AD. From Muscat, he goes to Hormuz, backtracking his way. From there to Lar and Shiraz. Via Yazd, Isfahan, and Kashan, he makes it back to Tabriz. Finally, to the camp of his old friend Hassan Beg, who is shocked to see that Nikitin is still alive. This is, of course, the Dabhol port. from a Portuguese drawing. And on the right-hand side is the Bijapur Mosque at Dabhol, which of course was much, much after Nikitin. He finally made it all the way back to Trebizond. But his misadventures and misfortunes kept dogging all his goods, finery, whatever he got, which had been bestowed on him by Muhammad Gawan and by Muhammad III, was all taken away from him. Uh, the ship that he had come back to Trebizond had to keep beating a retreat from the port 3 or 4 times because they just couldn't make it to port because of massive storms. And they finally made it to Kaffa, C-A-F-A today. Kaffa is what it was called then. And the manuscript more or less abruptly ends over here. And then there is a lot of Islamic intonation and prayers. On his way back, Nikitin died not far from Smolensk, somewhere in the spring of 1475. His notes were given to other Russian merchants who were traveling up and down the Volga, and they took them back to Vasily Mamirev, the secretary of Ivan III, the Grand Prince of Moscow, who was just shocked to find that somebody had gone all the way to India and come back. The Lwov Chronicle writes very specifically that uh, he received Nikitin's notes in 1475 itself. So it cannot have been that Nikitin lived beyond 1475 and incorporated them into his work, but was unable to learn anything more about the traveler. So Nikitin had already ceased to be uh, a known quantity or quality in his own world. After this, almost everybody forgot about Nikitin's voyage, and all his documents were virtually locked up and put away and forgotten. They were only revived and revised in 1821 when the entire manuscript was finally made available. A lot of people had referred to Nikitin and Nikitin's voyage, and Nikitin being a very early white man to go to India, but nothing really more. Most of it was all second-hand data. The text was republished in 1821 and became incredibly popular. The Russians were just amazingly blown away that there was somebody who had gone all the way there. The amount of factual material, you know, the ports that he talks about, Hormuz, Cambay, Calicut, Dabhol, Ceylon, Pegu, China. He's talking about India, he's talking about Burma, he's talking about China. All of this was stuff that was completely unknown and unheard to these people. So the processions he talked about, the worship he talked about, the different peoples, their clothes, their food habits, the Bahmani capital of Bidar, the great wonders of the fair at Parvatam as he talks about it, which I think he gets the name wrong, but then that's my personal this thing. And all of his comparison of things Russian and Indian, and they all deserve special notice. Upon finding out that he'd come to Chaul, the people of Chaul, along with the local collector's office, decided to do something about it and put up a Nikitin memorial. And this is the Nikitin memorial at Chaul in the grounds of the Chaul government school. These are the plaques on the 4 sides of the Nikitin memorial. And this is a beautiful stamp that was issued in Russia in 2021, honoring the 550th year of Nikitin's journey to India. On that note, that takes care of the first of our two travelers, and we now talk about Carsten Niebuhr, who lived from 1733 to 1850. He was a very interesting man. He was born in Ludwigsworth in the Duchy of Lauenburg. He appeared destined to follow in the footsteps of all his forebearers who were just small landowners. Surprisingly, when he came of age, he received a small amount of money as a patrimony. He took this and invested this in getting an education in mathematics, and by 1757 was a student at Göttingen University. He learned under Tobias Meyer himself, one of the greatest uh, geographers of his day, and of course ended up using his material to great benefit. Meyer, of course, was a German astronomer and a mathematician employed by Johann Baptist Homann's Institute in Nuremberg in 1744 and became professor of mathematics at Göttingen in 1751. He also took over the work of running the observatory there. He worked his entire life to get this famous bounty of 10 to 20,000 pounds that the British had put up for how to determine a longitude at sea. Latitude was not a problem, longitude was. And he was part of the three people who ultimately were awarded this, thanks to his great work, Nove Tabulae Mutum Solis et Lunae. Uh, he received a share of the prize. Sadly, he was dead, and it was only his wife, his widow, who got the money. Well, this is where the story of Niebuhr actually starts. On a winter evening 257 years ago, a lone horseman rode through the cobbled streets of Copenhagen towards the royal palace. Sunburnt and gaunt, Niebuhr was the only survivor of the great royal Danish expedition to Felix, Arabia, and had departed 7 years ago and was unheard of for the last few. This is the royal Danish expedition to Arabia and the places to which they went. Ended up back in Copenhagen again. And these are some of the places, important places that they went to. They went through Marseille to Constantinople. They got permission from the Ottomans at Constantinople. From here, they went to Egypt, to the Sinai. From the Sinai, they went to Jeddah. Uh, from there, they went to Mocha in Yemen. From there to Sana'a, the capital of Yemen. Uh, and ultimately, Niebuhr ended up with his team in Bombay. So, had it not been for the King of Denmark showing his largesse, the expedition to Felix Arabia would have never happened. Frederick V was painfully aware about how little Europe knew about the East and how much of it was rubbish and maps that said, "Here be dragons." So, enthralled by the achievements of Prussia's Frederick the Great, Frederick V responded to an expeditionary proposal put to him by Johann David Michaelis, a very distinguished theologian and Orientalist of the University of Göttingen, who put together a crew of 6 men. Uh, this whole crew came together. They went to Marseille, took ship to Constantinople. Upon reaching Constantinople, they got permission from the Ottoman authorities to travel to Arabia, and a 6-man crew landed in Alexandria. After a year in Egypt, the crew traveled to Jeddah, and south for nearly a year in Yemen. The expedition's artist George Willem Bodenfein sketched a beautiful court scene, which you see on the right-hand side. And by late 1763, when Niebuhr reached Bombay, 4 crew members were already dead. This is Niebuhr's painting of Bombay city at this time, and it is almost unidentifiable today. So Michaelis was a distinguished theologian and Orientalist at the University of Göttingen, and he wanted to look at the plants, the animals, the people, the script, the geography, the geology, and everything that he could find out about Arabia, as he called it, and their habits, customs, architecture, etc. He wanted to talk about the diseases and remedies, about what was available, any antique texts that were available, manuscripts, etc., and really wanted to go to St. Catherine's in the Sinai to see some of the amazing manuscripts that they had. Arabia was terra incognita to Europe. He chose 6 men. Frederick Christian von Haven of Denmark, who was the linguistics expert, the biologist Peter Foskal of Sweden, one of Linnaeus's direct students, the artist George Willem Bodenfein was a German, the physician Christian Karl Kramer of Denmark, Lars Berggren from Switzerland, who was the servant of the mission, taking care of everything, probably the most important guy, and cartographer and treasurer Carsten Niebuhr, who was a military surveyor who then held the rank of lieutenant. They went from Constantinople, they spent a year in Egypt. Niebuhr was fascinated by the pyramids. He calculated the height of the pyramids using his instruments really, really accurately. And most of us today are still stunned as to how accurate he was. He recorded hieroglyphs. He didn't know what they were, but he recorded them nonetheless, hoping that somebody could use his sketches and be able to do something about deciphering them. They changed into Arab dress and went east of Suez. And at Jebel at Mokateb, they recorded a huge number of inscriptions and rock carvings. Now, this is a very interesting place in the Sinai Peninsula. It has multiple names, and there are a vast number of very, very early inscriptions over there. When the philologist was not interested because he couldn't read them, Niebuhr nonetheless decided to sketch them and the various different etchings that were there and put them down on paper so that even if he couldn't get them, maybe somebody could later. These are some of the sites over there and some of the Egyptian, Proto-Syriac, Syriac, Nabatean, etc. inscriptions that we have at the site, along with beautiful etchings of Egyptian ships, which you see on the bottom right-hand side. There's also the massive temple of Hathor. Niebuhr had a very serious run-in with von Haven over here. Von Haven thought of Niebuhr as a country bumpkin. He ignored hieroglyphics and various other inscriptions, saying, if I can't read them, they're pointless. Niebuhr was worried about their knowledge. And if we record them, maybe somebody else will be able to do something about them. So at Serabit al Khadim, which is basically the temple of Hathor, just because he couldn't read them, he didn't. But Niebuhr went on to copy what he could. They then went to Jebel Musa, or basically the mountain of Moses, Mount Sinai. And they were at the foot of which lies St. Catherine's Monastery. This was one of the great monasteries of the world at that time, a massive library. Heaven looked forward to examining them, and the monks flatly refused. They refused the letter of introduction. They said, we have no idea what Constantinople is all about. It's none of our business, and you don't get to see anything, including the Codex Sinaiticus, one of the oldest Bibles in the world. And Haven was absolutely distraught. Niebuhr once again went to work, sketched the monastery, scaled the mountain, copied the inscriptions, and did all those things that, well, Haven should have been thinking of doing. This is Niebuhr's sketch of the monastery at that time. The team then sailed down the Red Sea to go to Jeddah, a 3-week journey, and managed to predict, thanks to their almanacs, an eclipse that was going to take place. The Arabs who witnessed this eclipse were shocked that these people could, with such accuracy, tell them this. And the pilgrims, who were basically ordinary people from small farms and villages, begged the scientists to cure chronic ailments, believed they had magic powers, and they ended up being stuck in Jeddah for quite some time. Niebuhr promptly went to work and mapped the entire town. Foscal set to work collecting seeds, but again, von Haven was not interested in anything, and he fell ill. Probably from, well, dealing with people who were already ill. The crew finally disembarked in 1762 on the 29th of December at the Yemeni port of Al-Luhaya. They reached a country that was completely a mystery to them. Nobody seemed to know anything about this, about Arabia Felix, which, by the way, means happy Arabia, Arabia Felix. And the expedition traveled to Yemen. Niebuhr trekked solo into the mountains, and he very often went in local dress. In late March, Forskal accompanied Niebuhr on a trip via Jobola to Thais, and Niebuhr became very, very ill. And this is a very interesting turning point in the journey. The expedition moved south along the coast to Mocha, headed inland to Sana, which was much, much cooler than the horribly humid tropical coast at Mocha. And the monsoon arrived, sadly, and they were stuck in torrential rain. This did not stop Niebuhr from keeping his work going. So this is one of his early plans of Mocha, which was then worked upon again. And this is the port of Mocha on the right-hand side, as pictured much later. Niebuhr took on local dress. He decided that it was European clothes that were doing them in, and European diets that were doing them in. He switched to a diet of tea and bread, and this was on the express this thing of the expedition's doctor, and managed to get well. Von Haven, on the other hand, succumbed to his fever in Mocha and died. On the route to Sana, Forskal suffered a very, very similar fate in Jerid at this point. The expedition continued deeper into the Yemeni interior. They rode into Sana, and Sana shocked them. They'd gone from a humid coast, a sandy, humid coast, to a sandy desert, and now suddenly they were in a city full of running water, shady streets, and they thought they were in paradise. Niebuhr mapped the city. His maps were so accurate that a century later, Gifford Palgrave, the famous Palgrave, dedicated his entire book to Niebuhr, saying that, I realized that so much before me, somebody had already come here and done all the work that I had to do. They decided to leave for Bombay and a more European port. And guess what happened on the way? First, Borenfield died 8 days into the journey, and then Berggren, the Swedish servant of the expedition, also died. Uh, Niebuhr recalled the irony that Arabia Felix meant a happy Arabia, but not for his expedition. They were down to two. He says these diseases were our fault. While my companions yet lived, I was myself several times very ill because, like them, I chose to live in European manner. He began to radically change all of that. He arrived in Bombay with Kramer. Kramer told him to do what Bathol described as a strict regiment of bread, rice, and tea. Niebuhr actually did this and managed to get bounced back, like I was saying. And then, much to his surprise, the doctor who had given him all this advice fell ill and died. We don't really know what all of them died of, but probably malaria, probably cholera. It's very, very difficult to tell. Niebuhr, though, was not alone. There were so many white people here, white people from all over Europe, and especially, of course, the British. He got rid of his Arab attire, learned the English language quickly. He was very good at these things, befriended the English officers, benefited from their hospitality, and gained access to their charts of the Indian seas, roads, harbors, southeast coast of Arabia, and diligently made copies of everything. On the right hand side is his map of Bombay, which for the longest time was the most accurate map of Bombay available to the public. I mean, I've used this in my lectures, and I have been very grateful to him for giving us a 18th century AD map of such detail. You can see the fort area of Bombay over here, right at the bottom, and he's got everything marked around, Parel over here and Worli Fort over here and all of that. Um, he started studying the history and trade of Mumbai and started making copious notes on both of these. In fact, one half of volume 2 of his story is all about what he did in India. He commented on the in the diary on the local alphabet. He talked about the local calendar, the caste system of the Parsis, and was very, very interested to see these people who lived here. He was one of the first people to systematically look at the Parsis, though they'd been mentioned before. He talked about the caste system, as I said. He talked about the wide interests of his and his observation of personal skills. He made a short trip to Surat to visit a festival. And then after coming back to Bombay, he decided he needed to go back home. He went to Persia in February of 1765 and sketched Persepolis of all things. So we don't know. There was nothing in his books that says he was in any way compromised. He decided to go back into native dress. He changed his name to Abdullah, and then he went chronicling his way back home. He was one of the first people to talk in detail about the Yazidis, who came into prominence sadly because of what ISIS did to them. He mapped small towns, villages, reached the Crusader fortress of Urfa, and rode into Aleppo on the 6th of June 1776. Quickly returned to European clothing and habits, neatly made his way back into society, studied the Druze, went to wherever he went, he mapped it. Okay, he visited Bethlehem and set off for home via Damascus and Constantinople. This is his beautiful sketch of Persepolis and how many of the pillars were still standing, how many of the gateways were still intact when he went there in the 6th decade of the 18th century. It's a priceless tool to archaeologists who have come afterwards. In 1801, the farm boy who had never mastered High German was honored in Paris as a corresponding fellow of the French Academy, a singular honor for a man who was a tiny little landowner of no great this thing. He continued to enjoy good health, though his eyesight began to fail him. He'd come back with a curious cold and a racking cough. perhaps tuberculosis, perhaps something else, perhaps damage to his lungs, which never fully disappeared in his life. And he died a few days before the Battle of Waterloo, aged 82, on the 26th of April, 1850. So alike and so different were these two men. They came from two different ages, one from the 15th century, one from the 18th century. And yet they observed in enormous detail everything that was happening around them. The people, their diets, their habits, their clothes, their castes, their cultures, the various different ethnic groups. At various times, they slipped into local dress to be more acceptable. They adopted local names in the case of both Nikitin and Niebuhr, and they left behind a very, very important narrative. They told their story in their own words. And this perhaps is the biggest favor that they did all of us. That they came here was one thing, that they left behind such a detailed account in their own words, that perhaps is the most important thing of all. So many people to thank. Most of all, Nikitin and Niebuhr for their words, my students and family, and all of you for listening to me. Tamam shud. Thank you very much. Let there be questions.
That was really a very, very engaging and insightful lecture about two people about whom we hardly knew much. I'm sure most of our audience also learnt about them for the first time. To moderate the question answer session, we have Dr. Shivram, a plastic surgeon associated with Tamil Heritage Trust. Over to you, Shivram.
Thanks, Gauri. That was quite fascinating, Dr. Dalal. As Badri and several of us confessed in the beginning, until THT announced these names, we were not even aware of these names, Nikitin and Niebuhr. Then we all scrambled and started looking up a little bit here and there. And fascinating. And you gave us a completely fascinating story of these kind of people who are not the usual travelers, if I might say that. Now, also between themselves are so different. What strikes me straight away is there is Niebuhr. Sounds completely academic, wants to sketch everything that he saw. The whole thing is totally not commercial. He doesn't seem to have been interested in riches. In fact, I read that when he went back, he had to pay 80% of the cost to publish his own works, unlike, say, all the others. So, and then there is Nikitin, who was mainly interested only in how we could explore the commercial lands and so on. So there are a few questions from the audience, if we can take them one by one. One of the earliest one is Ramesh Gauri Raghavan asking, was he not aware of his own countrymen in Rankiba locally? Did he not know where there is Singapore and Rankiba?
He doesn't seem to. He seems to be completely oblivious to them, and they weren't supposed to come to India. That's the most interesting thing about this, Ramesh. They were supposed to quietly do their work in Arabia and ship out of Persia. That was the directive. And they'd go overland to Constantinople or up the Persian Gulf and then through to Constantinople and then back home. Or maybe directly to one of the ports near Aleppo and then take a boat home. They were not supposed to come to India. So the decision to come to India changed everything, much to the happiness of Indian archaeologists and historians ever since. And of course, cartographers, not to mention others, because, well, by just making his observations, drawings, and paintings, Niebuhr changed the way we look at so much of the history of that period. See, he was also not a British colonialist speaking to us, which was very important. He was very categorically, very happily doing his own thing. He was acceptable to the British. He was friends with all of them. He fluently learned English very fast. He already spoke German, and of course, he spoke French, which were, well, if you had to study in that era, you had to. And he spoke Danish. He probably spoke a few other languages also. So, you know, having to publish his own work himself was sad. But again, thank God he published the 2 volumes.
Right. One question which has been burning within me for a long time, and I'm going to use this chance that Gauri has given me to ask. Whenever I read about all these guys traveling, Now, today, you gotta have people traveling from Chennai to Kerala and say, oh my God, I have to speak in Malayalam. I can't understand. The taxi driver doesn't understand, and so on. And there we have 500 years ago, fearlessly traveling to a foreign land, completely different language, culture, tradition, dress, religion, food, everything different. How did they even start? I mean, this is a common question. How did they start even communicating?
In the 15th century, most travelers who were traders spoke trade lingua. Okay, so they spoke various different pidgin which allowed them to communicate as far as trade was concerned. And most educated traders would speak either Persian or Arabic or both, even if they were Catholic, because they were traders and nothing else. A large number of educated uh, Muslims, to use that term slightly out of context, would also know Latin very often, because many of the texts that they referred to were in Latin. So there was a common ground on which they could both work. So they ended up, Nikitin ended up coming to India and probably speaking only Persian at Khambat, at Chaul, and then again at Bidar and Gulbarga. And that would have been
Right.
completely at ease, because the entire court was a Persianate court as far as the Bahmanis were concerned. So that was one good thing. In Niebuhr's case, they were all using translators by this time. So there would be somebody who spoke your language and the local language, and you would employ them temporarily. And in Tamil, for example, there is an entire word for people like this who do this. They are called dubhashis.
Subashis.
Dubash, yes. Who can
Dubashi
speak two
basically somebody
languages.
speaks two languages.
Yeah.
Often Dubashi spoke more, but that's not the case. So you have a lot of British accounts of landing, and then the first thing you were told as a Britisher going to India was that you needed to engage the services of a Dubash.
Yes.
The moment you did this, he would find you a house to stay, he would find you a sais to take care of your horses, he would find you somebody to cook for you, and all of this would be done through his family network. So he would have a cousin who was your cook, another cousin who was your khansama, your butler, a cousin's son who was taking care of your horses. He would also
Right.
know how to employ young women for you if you were single or you had not been accompanied by your wife. And you were there for 2 to 5 years. You didn't want to invest in property.
Right.
So, these kinds of people, local people in India were very adept. So, Dubash is the surname for the Parsis also. It's
Okay.
also a surname amongst the Muslims on the West Coast and the Hindus and in Gujarat. So, telling you that this term, Dubashi, okay, was a very, very commonly used term.
Okay. Another question. So I also had the same question, slightly different form. People asking about did he mention anything about temples at Hampi? Now I found it very curious that he's given a description of Vijayanagar, but he never been there. Rather like Max Miller, and a whole lot of descriptions, but not been there. How does it gel? And if you had
So,
not, what were his views on the Vijayanagar Empire's conflicts with the Bahmani Sultanate? Did he mention his
uh,
views?
to the best of my knowledge, he doesn't really mention the beautiful temples of Hampi at all because he didn't go there. On the other hand, discussing the fortifications at Hampi, discussing the city in general, and discussing the layout of the armies of Hampi would have been something that he would have been very, very easily able to get data on from Muhammad Gawan and Muhammad Gawan's, well, court of Muhammad III. So, these were things that were important to Muhammad Gawan. Muhammad Gawan didn't give a damn about the temples or palaces. He was interested in the fortifications, the river, the arable land, the people over there. So, this was data very easily got by him. Now, this is also a way in which data is gathered by geographers all over the world. So if you look at some of the greatest Islamic geographers, like Al-Masudi, who wrote in the 10th century AD, Masudi never left home. Herodotus wrote the histories without going anywhere. So you collected data at very important crossroads. And then you saw this data being repeated again and again and again by other travelers. So you said, okay, if 10 people are saying the same thing, then the veracity is greater than if one person is saying it. So there are some very, very odd things that come out of these texts. Sometimes you don't know how true it is and how not. For example, in Herodotus actually talks about the source of the Nile. Now, till Burton and Speke went down there and tracked down the source of the White Nile after tracking down the source of the Blue Nile, we had no idea where it actually came from. But Herodotus told us that the Nile originates from a small stream at the base of the mountains of the moon. And when Burton and Speke went to Lake Victoria and they tried to find the source of Lake Victoria, they found it in a stream coming out from two local mountains, which the local people called the Mountains of the Moon.
Good.
And supposedly Herodotus got his data from an Indian Brahmin. Now, what in God's name an Indian Brahmin was doing in deepest Africa and how he discussed this with Herodotus, I have not the faintest clue. And I don't think anybody will ever know. But we will never even know whether this truly happened this way. Was Herodotus just, throwing his cards on the table and saying whatever he felt like, and he hit the nail on the head repeatedly? Difficult to believe. But then Herodotus also said there are people in India whose stomachs have mouths so they can feed themselves directly.
Going from which the next question inevitably was bound to come. You had mentioned of stomach. You are a culinary expert, and did you identify any major Indian, Persian, or Arabic food recipes related to the information from Nikitin's notes?
Oh yes, for example, this whole thing about vegetables cooked in milk. Now, I find this very fascinating that Nikitin specifically says this, that khichdi is being eaten by people, pulses are being eaten and fed to horses. So is khichdi, jaggery, and ghee to horses, which I find very intriguing. And the fact that people were eating their khichdi, Hindus, that is specifically, with vegetables cooked either in ghee or in milk. Now, ghee is not a problem. How many of us cook our vegetables in milk? So was this milk or was this coconut milk?
Yes.
And he didn't realize that it was coconut milk because it was something completely alien to him.
Right.
It was white, it looked like milk, it tasted more or less like milk, it behaved like milk. It was milk. Or did he just say milk, meaning coconut milk, because it was taken for granted that the milk he cooked with was coconut milk, and he was just writing his own diary. So he knew what he was writing. So it's very, very interesting. But what if my conjecture is wrong and people were actually cooking with milk at that time?
Right. We wouldn't know, would we? Now, looking at again these two people in tandem, there is this academic Niebuhr who had to spend his own money publishing and then fantastic amount of work. And then you have Nikitin, of course, written extensively, but whole lot of celebrations. I was shocked to find there are pubs named after him, there's beer named after him, there are songs sung about him in band, popular pop groups have sung songs on Nikitin. And
there is an undersea mountain named after him.
And in 1958, an Indian filmmaker called Khwaja Abbas makes a film or based on Nikitin as well. I mean, this is fascinating on somebody who has written not so much on academic thing, but and then Niebuhr isn't that celebrated at all.
So Niebuhr isn't celebrated because Niebuhr didn't really travel in India. Bombay, brief trip to Surat, and then Bombay and back home. Bombay was more of a convalescing place for Niebuhr than a place that he ended up voluntarily at. So thanks to his very specialized bit of time that he spent in Bombay, and as I said, a brief sojourn to Surat, Niebuhr was not really etched into the minds of Indians as a historian of India or a traveler.
I have a small question to ask you. Did Niebuhr make all these beautiful maps totally on his own? What surveying equipment was he using? Like today, I don't know how many people will need to produce that kind of a map of Bombay or Persepolis and this and that. Like, amazing.
So he had an entire kit with him. And in fact, he talks about this twice or thrice in his books. And he's at a court and he's talking to the local ruler about these instruments of his. And he shows them his sextant and his compass. And he shows them his measuring tools. And loads and loads of people are just fascinated that with a small kit that he's carrying with himself, he's able to make such amazing cartographic material.
So accurate also.
Yes, and the interesting thing is a lot of his His sketches
Mm.
are three-dimensional sketches taken at a certain angle, which he could not have been at. So he's making his measurements on the ground. He's using trigonometry to get his heights. And then he's converting
Oh,
his notes into a sketch. And then he's tilting the entire sketch as though his
my
point
God.
of view is from the top.
My
So,
God.
this just takes Niebuhr to a completely different level
Yeah,
as to,
absolutely.
my God,
Yeah,
you know.
absolutely.
And he was
Amazing
not alone
artist.
at that time. Yes, he was not alone at that time.
Mm.
Many of the people who worked during that era were absolutely brilliant at what they did. And explorers were supposed to be virtual polymaths. Invariably, there were people who could pick up languages very well. They were very tough. I mean, I'm sure you had somebody speak about Oral Stein in these lectures. I mean, Stein looked like a bandy-legged tuberculotic man, a short, little, tiny little man. And he crossed the Taklamakan Desert repeatedly. He crossed it in the season of storms. The locals don't do it. His guide ran away. So, this whole breed of traveler, adventurer, spy, I mean, they're all rolled up in one. And they're just a different kind of people who march to a different drummer.
Yeah, and also Niebuhr lost almost everybody in the expedition.
Yeah.
He's almost everybody died one
Outlived them.
after another.
Yeah. Yeah.
Also, remember, please, that they died like flies. Huh? We
Yeah,
are only talking about the ones who came back from successful expeditions
Yeah.
and wrote
Yeah.
successful
Yeah.
travelogues and things like that. We are not talking about the ones who went and got eaten by natives, died of malaria, cholera, broke a leg in the middle of the
Yeah.
Hindu Kush, and starved and froze to death, and all of that.
Yeah.
We're not even talking about those poor fellows. So there were hundreds of them who went out there, and there were perhaps a dozen who made it back every century. So they were exalted for having done what they did. I mean,
Yeah.
they'd beaten the odds. They had gone in the face, Gauri, of everything. And in those days in India, and of course in many parts of Europe also, you didn't leave a circle of about 10
Yeah.
kilometers around your house. I mean, that was the furthest that you ever
Yeah.
went.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, even
a
10
lot of people
kilometers.
are like that now,
Yeah.
even now. A lot
Yeah.
of people are
Yeah.
like that even now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Gauri, how
Success.
are we doing in time?
I think you can ask. Are you having a couple of more questions?
Yes, we. One question somebody is asking: how does Nikitin's account of India differ from later European travelers like Barbosa or Nicola di Conti?
So Nikitin, while being a staunch Catholic, is not manic about his Christianity. We get a lot of very overt Christianity from the Portuguese. I mean, when it's somebody like Jordanius or something, that is taken for granted. If you're a monk, you're going to be talking about the heathens and looking down your nose at everybody. It's your job. But you get, Barbosa and so many others are very, very critical of everybody's faith. They're very, very critical of people left, right, and center. Nikitin, on the other hand, is just shocked. I mean, first of all, he can't handle the upper body nudity of Indian women and Indian men. Okay, but Indian women in particular, it's driving him nuts is very clear from his work. Uh, but it doesn't stop him from observing carefully that women wear a single plait running down their backs. Why he's
Actually,
looking
on
at
that note, I want to ask you, amidst all these factual observations, how did he talk about these mythical birds, animals, and monkey army? What was that supposed to be?
so the general consensus is that he was speaking to locals
Mm.
and that the locals had fascinating tales to tell him, and the ordinary tales he'd already got from everybody. So if you wanted to hold Nikitin's attention, you had to tell Nikitin something he'd not heard. So the more fantastical it was, the better it was. And Nikitin was all agog to write down all about these animals and birds
Mm.
and the king of the monkeys. The king of the monkeys story is also a little bit uh, I mean, there are people who think that they probably had a narration of the Ramayana,
Mm.
and
Mhm.
Nikitin didn't quite pick up the right bits. He only picked up the bits that suited his purposes.
Amazing.
And when
Right.
he asked questions pertaining to those, he was told about the Vanar Sena. Uh, and then he just put one and two together and made 10.
Maybe. Yeah, maybe.
Also, remember a lot of these were written by people who took his notes back and then might have added things to it.
No, so we have his text intact.
Intact.
Oh,
Okay, this is one of the good things. We have his text intact. Now, certain Russian words may have slightly different meanings, but just slightly. It's not really that difficult. The
okay, he
names are
wrote
the
totally
biggest
in
problem.
Russian
Yes, the
and
names are.
Niebuhr in German.
We don't know what Niebuhr wrote his original diaries in, as far as I know.
Oh,
We only have the published works, which were published by him in his lifetime.
yeah. Dr. Shukram, you have, shall we wind up?
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
That was fascinating.
It was really absolutely wonderful.
Such a refreshing and different insight into
Yeah.
wants us to go and read things which are not normally taught.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dalal. It was really delightful to have you here.
Thank you.
Now we
So
will
just
move on.
one addendum. As far as I know, Niebuhr's works were published widely in English. Okay.
In his
And
lifetime.
he wrote in English throughout his career.
Oh.
He didn't
Oh.
write in German.
He learned English after coming to India, but then he wrote also
And he
in
wrote
English.
in English.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's amazing.
Which is, again, it beats me why he would go back home and would publish in English.
Yeah.
But he did. Perhaps he thought that an English audience would appreciate him better.
Better.
Yeah. I mean,
Also, he might have thought Indians would also be able to read it better rather than German.
I don't think he was targeting the Indians at all. No?
Oh.
I don't think so at all.
Okay.
I'm very grateful to him for writing in English, but he was quickly translated into French, Dutch, and even German. So, once the book was out, from what I have managed to figure, I may be completely wrong. I'm be very happy to be corrected. He made a decent amount of money from the publication of his book. Not an enormous sum of money, but he definitely recovered his cost of publication, which he had to do on his own. And the book made him very, very famous, especially in academic circles. So other academics read his work, referred to his work, referenced his work, and because of which more academics read his work and was part of the curriculum in universities in his lifetime.
Oh, it's wonderful.
What we call the citation index.
Yes, citation index, yes.
No, but nice to be recognized in your lifetime. That's wonderful, actually.
It's very, very true.
Okay. Yeah, we'll move on
Thank
to
you
the
very
second.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Gauri.
Thank you.
Sorry
Thank
for
you.
taking up some of your time, Dr. House.
No, that's absolutely fine. We'll move on to the second lecture of the day. Moving on to the second talk for today, it is called Fort St. George to Srirangapatna, Lady Clive's Journey, 1800, to be delivered by Dr. Jennifer Hose. Lady Henrietta Clive, 1758 to 1830, was the feisty, independent wife of Edward Clive, the governor of Madras from 1798 to 1803, Common Era. After the death of Tipu Sultan in 1799, she wanted to see the capital city of the Mysore Sultanate. In March 1800, she travelled from Fort St. George to Srirangapatna, accompanied by her two young daughters, their Italian governess, and a vast entourage. In her talk, Dr. Horse will examine the drawings and journal entries they accumulated to give an account of the journey. A little bit about our speaker. Dr. Jennifer Horse is a UK-based art historian who writes about South Asia and colonialism. Her work connects archival sources with art to narrate new approaches to colonial history. Her most recent book, The Art of a Corporation, examines the East India Company's history by examining the artworks it commissioned and collected in London. A very warm welcome to you, Dr. Horse. We're delighted to have you. You may now take over the screen and deliver your lecture.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful introduction. Thank you. And hello to everyone out there and all the people who will watch this in the future on YouTube, I hope. Right, and now I go to slideshow. Has that worked? Can you see my slide? Oh, hold on. Continue.
Yeah.
Where's my mouse? There it is. Okay. There.
Yeah, it's fine.
Can you all see my first slide?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. Hello, I will begin now. So just a quick introduction to this slide. It shows the seafront concourse at Madras as it appeared in around 1800. And then in the left side, I have placed this little picture of this tiger head ornament, which I will now tell you a bit more about. In mid-May 1799, a week after Tipu Sultan was killed in battle at Srirangapatna, a delegation of British military commanders arrived at Fort St. George and gave this object to Henrietta Clive. It is one of the jeweled tiger head ornaments from the gold throne of Tipu Sultan. When the British discovered Tipu's gold throne after the fall of Srirangapatna in May 1799, it was torn apart. Some of its ornamentation, such as this tiger head, was kept intact and distributed as gifts. This ornament was part of the first trickle of loot to arrive at Fort St. George. When it was placed in Henrietta Clive's hands, she had been at Madras for 10 months. Henrietta was caught up in the wave of British self-congratulation over the siege of Srirangapatna. But in one of her letters, she expressed sadness that Tipu's gold throne had been broken into pieces. In the very same letter, Henrietta wrote about her wish to travel to Srirangapatna. Her husband, Edward Clive, the governor of Madras, who also happened to be the son of Robert Clive, was planning an overland journey there, along with Richard Wellesley, the East India Company's Governor General. Henrietta planned to travel there with them. But by the end of that month, by the end of May 1799, the trip was cancelled. So Henrietta was undeterred. She made her own plans to travel to Srirangapatna without her husband. This paper looks at Henrietta Clive's journey to Srirangapatna in 1800, as described in her letters. Today, those letters are in the National Archives of Wales and in the British Library. Many of them have been published in Nancy Shields' book, Birds of Passage. And I will now show you this is my copy of Birds of Passage. I believe it is, this is the English edition, but I believe it's also published in India by Manohar. Henrietta's letters describe looted objects, such as this tiger head. She also observed the chaos that war had inflicted on the kingdom of Mysore. She met with different members of Tipu Sultan's family, and she gave rare descriptions of the hundreds of female courtiers that lived inside the palace at Srirangapatna. So a quick map. I've circled places where the East India Company had troops at this time. So they had troops stationed at Vellore and Bangalore in particular. So these delineate the stages of the route from Fort St. George to Srirangapatna. Vellore and Bangalore were important rest stops. Before looking at the journey in 1800, I want to introduce Henrietta Clive to you a little bit better and explain a little bit more about what she was doing in India. She was born Henrietta Herbert in 1758. Her father, the Earl of Powys, owned vast tracts of land in Wales and Shropshire. The family was property rich and owned several estates, of which Powys Castle, pictured here, was just one. But the Herbert family was saddled with debts. Henrietta's marriage to Edward Clive, the eldest son of Robert Clive, was a match that boosted her family's fortunes. After Henrietta's father died, the family title, the Earl of Powys, went on to Henrietta's brother. And then when her brother died in 1801, Henrietta's eldest son, the grandson of Robert Clive, became the new Earl of Powys. So this is Edward Clive, Henrietta's husband, pictured on the left. He became the governor of Madras in 1797. And in 1798, Henrietta made the journey to Fort St. George to be with her husband. She traveled there with her two young daughters, Charlotte and Harriet. Henrietta also brought with her a travel companion, the Florentine artist, Anna Tonelli. So here you have the two daughters pictured on the right with their pet dogs. Henrietta and Edward Clive also had two sons, but they remained in the UK. They were studying at Eton College, and their uncle, Henrietta's brother, the Earl of Powys, was appointed as their guardian. Henrietta and her daughters sailed from Portsmouth to Madras in 1798. The journey took 5 months. They departed in April, and they reached Madras in late August. So on August the 21st, 1798, they arrived at Madras, and they wrote in their letters how they traveled to shore on a Masula boat. I'm sure you're all somewhat familiar with these structures. They are tall wooden rowboats that were used to carry people and cargo from ship to shore. At that time, Madras had no harbor, so ships had to anchor far from the shoreline. Masula boats were the safest way to get through the dangerous surf to the beach. Passengers were guaranteed a soaking in salt water. Now, this next picture this is quite a famous picture. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. It's titled Madras Landing. And it shows these Masula boats on the shore, on the beach, and they are disgorging European passengers. It also shows, you can see the facades of the buildings that faced the sea. And in the distance, you can see what I believe to be Fort St. George. Once ashore, Henrietta, her daughters, and Anna Tonelli were moved by palanquin along the busy concourse, which was crammed with people. They saw sepoys for the first time, and the girls laughed to see men with beards wearing what to them looked like women's clothing. Their home was a 2-story corner house with a low-walled garden inside Fort St. George. It was smaller than what they were used to in England. Henrietta loathed this house. She described it as a cage. And whenever she stepped outside, she was surrounded by, and I quote, "Faithful attendants. Women with parasols appear the moment I go outdoors that no entreaty can get rid of." Beyond the fort, Europeans were building spacious garden houses in Triplicane. Henrietta arranged for one of these large houses to be built for herself and the girls. Henrietta struggled to socialize with other Europeans at Madras. She described her new home as devoid of society, and she saw the local Europeans as existing on, and I quote here, "nothing but business and solitude." Her attempts to befriend other European women went badly, and she failed to get along with the formidable Lady Helena Oakley. She was the woman who controlled the social scene at Madras at that time. In one letter, she wrote, "It is impossible to imagine the sameness and dullness of this place." So before I change slides, the picture on the right shows Lady Helena Oakley dancing with Vice Admiral Edward Hughes. And it's by a Tamil artist. I find it quite an arresting image. It shows how, I think it shows how silly Europeans looked to Indians. While she was struggling with her new circumstances, Henrietta received an unexpected house guest. Richard Colley Wellesley, the East India Company's Governor General at Calcutta, arrived at Madras on New Year's Eve, 1798. So I've put into portraits of Richard Wellesley here. So there's the head and shoulders portrait on the right. And then on the left, if I just, this is, it's just a black and white photo of a full-length portrait of him. And you can see in the background, this is St. Mary's Church inside Fort St. George. And then in the middle ground here, there's a military parade featuring, you can just see it here, there's a flag with a sun on it. And that flag with the swirling sun on it was the flag that the British took from Srirangapatna that had belonged to Tipu Sultan. And they had this ceremony that was all about the defeat of Srirangapatna. And then they sent the flag to King George III. Richard Wellesley remained at Fort St. George for 8 months. Eventually, he returned to Calcutta on the 5th of September, 1799. So his stay lasted 248 days. And I think that Henrietta counted every single one of those 248 days. She described him as arrogant. And she wrote and I quote here, "I shall be glad when he is gone. He is extremely pompous." Whenever Richard Wellesley ventured outside the fort, he was accompanied by an entourage of 20 bodyguards, which Henrietta complained was, I quote, "more guards than the king." Richard Wellesley was also nervous about his health, and he thought that excessive travel might kill him. So if he was so anxious about traveling, then why did he come from Calcutta to Madras? I think we can all guess. Richard Wellesley was in Madras because he was about to wage war against Tipu Sultan. His younger brother, Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, was a commander in the invading army, and he was positioned and ready to lay siege to Mysore. It was very much a family operation, with Richard operating out of Fort St. George, Arthur preparing for the invasion, and then there was a third brother, Henry Wellesley, who he was more an administrator person. He was flitting about as well. After Tipu's death, Richard placed Arthur in charge of Srirangapatna. When the Fourth Mysore War began in February 1799, Fort St. George filled up with terrified British women who, not wanting to remain in their triplicane country houses, sought protection inside the fort. And Henrietta, who was already in the fort, was forbidden to leave. Her menfolk were concerned about Tipu's soldiers reaching Madras. So she was stuck in Fort St. George with more people than the fort could really cope with. And then it was March, and then it was April, and the temperature soared inside the overcrowded fort. And then in May, news reached them of the fall of Srirangapatna. And this first trickle of loot, including the jeweled tiger head, reached Fort St. George. So in the middle of this slide, I've put just a little narrow picture of a detail of a music box, which I think some of you might be familiar with. It's called Tipu's Tiger. And it was sent to East India House in London in 1799. And it is now part of the Victoria and Albert Museum's collections. And it's on display at the moment. It's on the floor. But it's the middle of Tipu's Tiger is it's a music box organ type mechanism that was made in France. And then it is surrounded by this wood and metal automaton, this structure, which it moves when the organ plays. And this tiger rears up and down and lunges at the neck of the Englishman, and the Englishman's arm sort of tries to bat it away. And you can see he has a pipe sticking out of his mouth, which lets loose a horrible noise. Oh, and then this other piece of loot that was removed in the early days of immediately after the invasion. That is this crouching tiger with crystal fangs and eyes that was part of Tipu Sultan's throne of gold. Henrietta was desperate to leave the fort, and she longed to travel to Srirangapatna. She had every intention of going there with her husband and Richard Wellesley, but then Richard Wellesley cancelled the trip, allegedly because of his health worries. But Henrietta was she was determined. And 10 months later, in March 1800, she finally left Madras for Srirangapatna, along with her daughters and Signora Anna Tinelli. And 6 elephants, 2 camels, 100 bullocks to draw their baggage carts. They also brought with them all their servants, because, I quote, "Traveling in India is not like traveling in Europe." When all were assembled, they amounted to 750 people. This seems excessive, but according to 12-year-old Charlotte, it was, I quote, "not in India a very great number." Edward Clive accompanied them on the first few days of the journey. They traveled together through Madras Presidency towards Kanchipuram. So we have, there's Fort St. George, and then they wrote it as Kanjivaram, yes. So there's where Kanchipuram is. At every village they traveled through, they were offered limes and garlands of flowers. Musicians and dancers appeared on the road, guiding them towards each new settlement. These dancers were a barometer of each place's wealth and sophistication. Henrietta described them as, I quote, "very handsome, and from them you may have a good idea of the wealth of the inhabitants in the village or town they belong to, as they are always richly dressed. The Indians are particularly fond of show, and indeed, we but seldom met with any that were without jewels." They then traveled on to Chengalpattu, and the local governor met them. He was accompanied by more dancing girls and musicians who played kettle drums that were so large they were strapped to a bullock. Henrietta's vast entourage set up their camp 2 miles beyond Chengalpattu and were entertained there by, and I quote, "dancers, tumblers, and rope dancers, who performed before the tents extremely well, particularly the tumblers, one of whom carried a girl on his shoulders standing upright, while she held with one hand a large earthenware vessel." At Chengalpattu, Edward Clive returned to Madras, and Henrietta continued the journey, reaching Vellore on the 15th of March. So there's Vellore right there. So you can see it's right next to, the pink area is the area that was controlled by the East India Company, and the blue area was not. So you're getting very close to the border with Mysore. During the Mysore Wars, Vellore was an important East India Company military base because it was near the border with Mysore. This map shows the territory controlled by the East India Company as pink and the Mysore Sultanate as blue. With its large moat, Vellore Fort was a secure location that was easy to guard. After the war, the British used it as a low security prison for its new high status enemies. In June 1799, Tipu Sultan's 4 eldest sons, the first of these high status prisoners, were moved to Vellore. As these four were the most likely heirs to Tipu's throne, the East India Company wanted to remove them from Mysore Kingdom. They wanted to eliminate any chances of them igniting an insurgency. So in June 1799, here they are, the four eldest sons. They were moved to Vellore Fort, and pretty much immediately after they were removed, the British placed on the throne of Mysore a 6-year-old boy from the Wodeyar family, the dynasty that had controlled Mysore before Hyder Ali established the Mysore Sultanate. So the British, they didn't want the four eldest sons of Tipu to be in Mysore on the day of the Wodeyar king's coronation. Henrietta met these sons inside Vellore Fort in late March 1800, when they were about 9 months into their internment there. So the two sons on the right side of this slide, so these two here, they were the same two boys who were taken as hostages by Charles Cornwallis after the Third Mysore War in 1792. So they had lived at Madras in 1792 and all of 1793. Then they were released in early 1794. Abdul Khalik, the one in yellow on the far right side, was one of the hostage sons. Henrietta described him as of low birth, and I quote, his mother having been a slave. She described him as having a sulky countenance, and she noted that the other three brothers treated him with contempt. When Abdul Khalik left the audience with her, the other three brothers said they would not have come if they'd known he was going to be there. The prince at the middle left, who's wearing a pink sash, was Muiz ud-Din. The British regarded him as the most likely heir to the Sultanate throne of Mysore because his mother was from an important family. Her father had served as Hyder Ali's general, and she was married to Tipu according to Islamic law. So Harriet described Muiz ud-Din as the Padshah because he was Tipu's eldest legitimate son. Oh, and she also noted that he had very good manners. Henrietta remarked that, and I quote, there is a great appearance of gentleness in his countenance. Tipu's eldest son, Fateh Hyder, is pictured on the far left of this slide. He's the one wearing a large pink turban. Henrietta described him as fat and as most closely resembling Tipu Sultan. He certainly got the mustache for it. He had never seen an English woman before. He was the son of a dancer of Tipu's court. And although Henrietta saw him as illegitimate, she did remark that he too had beautiful manners. And I quote, he passes his time reading and in his zanana in great retirement, in a continual regret for having surrendered himself as a prisoner. Henrietta described Fateh Hyder as having something fierce in his aspect and a look in his eye that suggested, I quote, a wish to have the English in his power. Fateh Hyder had 7 children, but when Henrietta met him, all of them had died. Henrietta speculated that, and I quote, had Tipu died a natural death, there would have been a struggle between Fateh Hyder and the Padshah. Before they were exiled, all 4 of these sons each lived in large, separate homes on the island of Srirangapatna, where they had space to set up their families and their private entourages. After their exile to Vellore, their beautiful homes were requisitioned and used by the British. The 4 eldest sons of Tipu were now forced to live inside the same set of buildings inside Vellore Fort, and they argued constantly. Inside Vellore Fort, Henrietta also saw the apartments that the British were constructing for the women of Tipu Sultan's court. These 2 complexes of apartments, known as the Tipu Mahal and the Hyder Mahal, are still standing inside Vellore Fort. The Tipu Mahal apartments are today used as residences for the Tamil Nadu State Police. And I would love to see them for myself, but obviously for security reasons, this isn't possible. When the apartments were completed in 1802, the women of Tipu Sultan's court were moved from Srirangapatna to Vellore. Henrietta described the apartments that she saw under construction as follows. So I quote, "The Zanana is generally a square building with high walls, consisting of a court with 8 small rooms and a veranda, divided into 2 stories, which are sufficient for 4 ladies and their attendants." Henrietta described the apartments and their intended inhabitants in a way that suggests a natural understanding of their domestic hierarchy. After all, Henrietta herself was a high-ranking woman who was attended by many servants. So the hundreds of royal women who were moved into this building, this complex, the Tipu Mahal, and to the Hyder Mahal at Vellore, were not equals. Most of the women were servants and slaves and attendants who worked for the high-ranking women. Henrietta and her party left Vellore on the 17th of March. And as they traveled westward, for the first time, they entered what was Mysore Kingdom. They encountered forts that were constructed by Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan. They were now in an area that had been stricken by warfare, looting, and banditry. Curious crowds no longer gathered at the roadside. They were no longer welcomed into settlements by dancers and musicians. Henrietta wrote, and I quote, "There are scarce any inhabitants near the road. They are not yet accustomed to the English and are afraid of having their things seized by the regiments marching through the country. Therefore, they live at a great distance." In another letter, she wrote that the English officers had been, and I quote again, "beating and pillaging the country people. The sight of a red coat raises alarm. Even the bodyguard, if they go into a village, spread a degree of fear." So the local people were being so routinely abused that they lived in fear of groups traveling through the countryside. If they saw a procession in the distance, they hid. Settlements were moved away from roads because they were used by soldiers and bandits. It was an oppressive time to be an ordinary person in the countryside, with armed marauders raiding villages and robbing travelers. So Henrietta's group went to some of Mysore's hill forts. So on the 23rd of March, they saw Venkatagiri, which is here. And then they went down to Krishnagiri on the 29th of March. And then on the 31st of March, they reached Rayakotai. Oh, and this is a picture of Rayakotai here. And this is Krishnagiri. So they arrived at Rayakotai. And by the time they got there, they were quite unwell. It was also getting uncomfortably hot. So they paused at Rayakotai for over a month. They didn't reach Bangalore until the 18th of May. And they stayed there until the 24th of July. At Bangalore, they were allowed to stay inside Tipu Sultan's summer palace. Henrietta was plagued by aches and pains, and she described using Tipu Sultan's bathtubs. I reckon it sounds like she had dengue fever from the accounts in her letters. As for the bathtub, I would be very interested to know if anyone has recently been to Tipu Sultan's summer palace in Bangalore, and if so, whether there is a large stone bathtub there. I've looked on the internet and haven't found any mention of it. They delayed their departure from Bangalore because there were reports of a brigand army to the north of Bangalore, commanded by Dundiya, one of Tipu's former soldiers. So Dundiya was a disgraced soldier of the Mysore Sultanate army who Tipu Sultan had put in jail. But when Srirangapatna fell in May 1799, the British released all of Tipu's prisoners. Dundiya escaped to the countryside and raised an army of a suspected 10,000 men. And the British saw this as a significant enemy uprising. So they sought to quell Dundiya and his army. And if you look at the timings of Henrietta's trip and the campaign to eliminate Dundiya, you can see there's a remarkable correspondence. So in July 1800, it appears when this action started that it was motivated by the news that Henrietta Clive was about to move from Bangalore to Srirangapatna. It would have been a disaster if the wife of the governor of Madras was set upon by a brigand army. So Dundiya was, he was estimated to be 100 miles north of Bangalore, too close. So they sent out, the British sent out an army to quell them. One suspects that Henrietta was not allowed to leave Bangalore until this potential threat was averted. In July 1800, while Henrietta was still in Bangalore, the British cavalry, under Arthur Wellesley's command, set out to capture Dundiya, and they killed him on the 9th of September. Henrietta's party finally reached Srirangapatna on the 6th of August. So here you have Bangalore and Srirangapatna. Finally, Henrietta saw the place where the gold tiger head came from. The throne was long gone, but they saw drawings of it. They saw drawings of it, and Anna Tinelli used these to make a watercolor of what it might have looked like. So Anna Tinelli's watercolor is at the center here. It's the one that she's put into it what Tipu Sultan might have looked like sitting upon it. The two drawings on the left, this one and this one, were by Captain Thomas Marriott, the young man who was appointed to oversee the care of Tipu Sultan's family. He had claimed as his quarters the room that was next to where the gold throne was. So Thomas Marriott would have witnessed the throne's destruction. The picture on the right, that's a lithograph based on a drawing by a court artist from Mysore. Here are some parts of Tipu's throne which are today in the UK. So top left, we have the tiger head that was given to Henrietta Clive. It's now in the museum in Powys Castle in Wales. Then the bottom left, you have this crouching tiger, which I showed earlier. It has crystal fangs and eyes. And this was from the front of Tipu's throne. If you look at this drawing here, you can see where the crouching tiger head emerged, and likewise here in this drawing. Oh, this drawing here, this is another drawing by Thomas Marriott. It shows a plan of giving an idea of the shape of the throne. And then on the top right, you have the huma bird, who is this mythical bird that would hover above the throne. It was attached by a rod to the throne's canopy. So the huma bird and the crouching tiger were given to King George III. And you can see the crouching tiger in Windsor Castle. I saw it in Windsor Castle just a few months ago. It's on display there. The huma bird, it's part of the royal collection still, but it is not on display. It should be, though. At Srirangapatna, Harriet and her entourage camped at the Darya Dalit Bagh. So I'm sure you're all familiar with this building. It's set inside a beautiful garden, and it's painted. The outside walls are painted with these interesting murals. Here's a picture of the interior. Now, it just so happens that Arthur Wellesley, the Governor General's little brother, had claimed the Darya Dalit Bagh as his private lodgings and office. So I'm not sure what's going on here, but it seems, well, Arthur Wellesley, he was out chasing Dundia somewhere north of Bangalore at this point. So Henrietta and her party, Henrietta, who had been set upon by Arthur Wellesley's elder brother as a house guest, she took over the Darya Dalit Bagh. On the exterior wall of the Darya Dalit Bagh is this famous mural painting of the Battle of Pollilur of 1780. Henrietta remarked that the mural was, and I quote, "most vilely done in complete Eastern manner, without the least regard for perspective. Those of Bailey's defeat that's this painting here, are very absurd. Some people are without their heads, others cut in two. I find it interesting, the effect of this painting on the British who first saw it. At Srirangapatna, Henrietta was taken by Captain Thomas Marryat, the one who did the drawings of the throne, to meet the younger sons of Tipu Sultan. And Henrietta described them as fine little boys. Thomas Marryat, who's pictured here on the left, was responsible for the arrangements of Tipu Sultan's entire extended family. In June 1801, he arranged for these three boys to go to Vellore because the British decided that they had come of age. So apparently the British decided they were now a threat. So they moved them to Vellore in 1801. And then the following year, in May, June 1802, the women's apartments inside Vellore Fort were completed. And Thomas Marryat arranged for the hundreds of women of Tipu's courts to be exiled there. This is part of a report that was authored by Thomas Marryat in May 1800. So it was authored just 2-3 months before Henrietta arrived at Srirangapatna. And he does his best to describe the women who lived in the palace. And he counted their 601 women as being there. This is the total here. Total women in both, 601. So just over half of the women, 333 of them in total, lived in the zanana known as the Tipu Mahal. See here, in Tipu Sultan's Mahal. And they were, as the name suggests, Tipu Sultan's private female entourage. The Tipu Mahal is described on this left-hand page of the report. And then on the right-hand page over here, you have the Hyder Mahal. And the Hyder Mahal was where the other 268 women lived. So the Hyder Mahal's women were the female entourage of Tipu's deceased father, Hyder Ali. So one of these women was Tipu Sultan's mother, and many others would have been like Tipu's stepmothers. As a child, Tipu Sultan would have lived in the Hyder Mahal, along with his young brothers and sisters. So he was duty-bound to take care of the women of the Hyder Mahal. These were his family. So when Thomas Marryat compiled this report, there were a total of 601 women. So they were living in these two different zananas, these two different mahals. Henrietta and her two daughters visited both of the mahals. Their fascination with meeting these women was mutual. Henrietta wrote, and I quote, "They are quarrelsome and rarely meet, but they did so on this occasion to see us." Henrietta and her daughters wrote about their meeting with the Hyder Mahal's women. They noted that the most senior wife of Hyder Ali, I quote, "is a very clever woman and can read and write Persian. Regarding the most senior women of the Hyder Mahal, Harriet wrote, "They each have slaves, and there is only one man allowed to go into the Zenana." They describe the Zenana buildings as, I quote, "large. The court in the middle has trees planted in it, and on each side there are verandas where the ladies sit when they meet each other." So they met with the Hyder Mahal's women on what they described as 9 or 10 different verandas. And on one of these verandas, there were 30 or 40 women assembled. So these are big spaces. These are big verandas. One of the senior wives of Hyder Ali was too unwell to leave her room, so Henrietta and her daughters went into it, and they wrote that her room was 10 feet long and 6 feet broad, so quite small for a senior wife. Now, if you compare this with the new apartments that were being constructed at Vellore, those apartments that were they saw in the process of being built, they had more spacious private rooms, but they had smaller, there were smaller communal spaces. So by contrast, the Hyder Mahal at Srirangapatna had a large courtyard filled with trees and at least 10 shared balconies that overlooked the courtyard. During their visit, at least one of those balconies could accommodate between 30 and 40 people. And that was just the Hyder Mahal. The Tipu Mahal at Srirangapatna was a newer structure, so it would have been bigger. While the mahals that the British were constructing at Vellore had larger private accommodation, they lacked the large, airy, shared spaces that the women were used to. So in other words, their accommodations at Vellore were just simply not going to be the same as the Zenanas they were leaving behind at Srirangapatna. Henrietta noted that Hyder's elderly wife cried so much that it was really painful to see her. I was really glad to quit her. She was really distressed to a great degree. It is not surprising. She remarked that all of the women cried a great deal. Perhaps this was their way of asking for some help. They were imploring this foreign woman and her daughters to somehow guide them through their baffling new change in circumstances. Instead, the women's care was being organized by a young man. At the age of 26, Captain Thomas Marriott was absurdly placed in charge of the hundreds of female courtiers living in the mahals. He was selected for this job because of his skill with languages. He had worked as an interpreter in the Madras army, and he also knew the 2 sons of Tipu Sultan who had been taken hostage in 1792. So he was one of the few people at Srirangapatna who had language abilities and who had past dealings with any member of Tipu Sultan's family. And now he was in charge of 601 women. What could possibly go wrong? Well, quite a lot went wrong, and the actions of these women under East India Company rule is the subject of my current research. But I'm not going to get into that now. Henrietta and Charlotte's letters about meeting the women of Tipu's court are important documents. they give a fleeting glance of how these hundreds of women lived before they were exiled to Vellore. This information builds into my research on these female courtiers and how they dealt with their unusual treatment by the East India Company. The journey of Henrietta Clive from Fort St. George to Srirangapatna is a good way to set the scene for this research. Her descriptions highlight the fragile, war-ravaged conditions of Mysore Kingdom in 1800, the aggressive way the British drained the Sultanate's wealth, and the crimes that were inflicted upon the people who lived in the surrounding countryside. Most descriptions of Srirangapatna after the Fourth Mysore War are patchy accounts authored by soldiers who were there when Tipu Sultan was killed. They don't extend into descriptions of the surrounding countryside. And they either fail to mention the plight of women, or they give completely undependable information. So Henrietta's descriptions are, you could say, the opposite way around. Her journey begins at the periphery at Fort St. George when she learned of Srirangapatna's fall and the jeweled tiger head that was pressed into her hands. As she inched closer to Srirangapatna, she witnessed the chaos that engulfed the kingdom. And when she reached Srirangapatna, she was permitted to visit the women of Tipu Sultan's inner court, the most secretive and misunderstood members of the dead king's entourage. Thank you.
You can stop sharing. Yeah. Yeah, that was nice and
Thank you.
gave a very different perspective of an Indian traveler through the colonial times and what she saw. If I can ask Dr. Shivram to moderate the question answer session.
Yeah, hi. That is, I found it fascinating at actually several levels. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
First of all, Dr. House, thank you for very measured, calibrated, and also a bit suspenseful, telling us that you're going to work on something and just about hinting that you're embarked on a major project on how women feel and women felt and women treated at the time. Now, this is by itself to me a very fascinating thing for what we've seen in the last few days and also what we know. The overwhelming travelers are all men. The overwhelming accounts of the world outside their own place is all by men. The overwhelming account of the women is all by men again. And yet here we have a woman traveling in the aftermath of the last Anglo-Mysore War in the reverse direction from a place of safe haven like the Madras Fort, all the way into a battle-torn, ravaged area where people are looking at them with suspicion, and yet ventured enough right across into what was still a few weeks back, literally enemy territory, and allowed by the people to do so. And that I find itself very fascinating. The personal touch interest, of course, is mine. Both the museum at Srirangapatna and at Fort St. George were curated by my father-in-law, my wife's is archaeologist, and my personal favorite there. Now, people have asked several questions here. So, first question is, how did this British establishment allow a woman to travel into a war-torn, battle-scarred area which has just completed they wouldn't have known it is the last Anglo-Mysore War, right? We now know that the Fourth War was the last, and after Tipu, everything passed on. But they didn't know that.
Yes.
How did they allow that to her to go with such an entourage? First question.
Well, short answer, she was very determined. I do find it interesting that she couldn't go to Srirangapatna until after Richard Wellesley had left Fort St. George. I think that if she had, just decided to head off before he had left, that would have been seen as an insult and an affront to him, that, a woman could do something that he didn't have the guts to do. I also think that without Richard Wellesley around, that her husband, Edward Clive, was perhaps not quite so firm with her, that she was a very single-minded person, and she was used to getting her way with her husband. Yeah, so off she went. I mean, I did find in the letters hints at men deterring her from going. In the party who arrive at Fort St. George with the first items of loot, including the jeweled tiger head. One of them is Alexander Allen, who is responsible for a lot of the drawings that I showed in the talk. And Alexander Allen pretty much says to her, it's a terrible, desperate place. You mustn't go there. And she just ignores him.
When you started, you were telling us about how, say, Chengalpat and Kanchipuram, they were welcomed with this dancing women and entertainers, and they had a lovely time. And cross on board, and suddenly a chill descends on the place. There is no welcome. In fact, there is a lot of hostility and suspicion about these people. Now, does she mention about, like, maybe I should turn back?
No,
or is she determined to go?
Well, she had a lot of people with her. Presumably, she also had soldiers with her to make sure she was safe. But yes, it is quite startling, the contrast between Madras presidency and then entering into Madras. I mean, there's a real feel that they were obviously towns and communities along these main roads, and they abandoned everything and ran as far away from the roads as they could. The roads were dangerous places.
And that didn't put them off from proceeding with the journey.
No.
The other conflicting, if I might say, or confusing thing for me was, we see these paintings where these courtyards and this woman with their musical instruments and their hookah, smoking pipes and
yes,
whisks, fly whisks, and so on. And then you mentioned that Henrietta says, well, the private rooms were 10 feet by 6 feet, which is smaller than most of the bathrooms that we have.
Yes.
And how does it, I mean, was this an anomaly, or was it an unusual thing, or was it a usual thing that, like, someone couldn't kind of wrap my head around that size?
Yeah, well, those pictures, they're on the exterior of the Darya Dalat Bagh. And the one of the woman, so there's the one main woman on what I take to be a veranda, and she is surrounded by attendants. So as I mentioned before, there was a large courtyard, and then surrounding the courtyard, there were these large verandas which were breezy, open places. And women the high status women would lounge upon these verandas, and they would be surrounded by attendants. I mean, you look at the objects that are around her in that picture, and there are, she has a book next to her. She has something for sprinkling rose water, one of these sort of things. There are musicians, there are singers. There's someone with a fan. So you went to these verandas, these communal spaces, to enjoy music, to have, to do your eating and drinking, to converse with your companions. And then I guess your private room was just a little pokey spot where you kept your stuff. You slept.
Yeah, I think the Indian lifestyle, because of our climate and everything, was such that they didn't really spend so much of time completely indoors. These communal
Yeah.
spaces are somewhat like semi-open spaces. And if you see, that's how the European lifestyle is so different from ours, either because of climate or whatever, which is why the Britishers have built those quarters according to their understanding of lifestyle, having large
Yeah.
private quarters and smaller communal spaces. Whereas that's not how it worked in India. If you see in other houses also, generally, our private rooms are relatively small, whereas the courtyards and the verandas around are large, which is where most of the time is anyway spent. So
Yes.
perhaps that's a natural extension of that.
I agree. I mean, I recently went to it was a sort of a cloister, you know, where nuns lived, and I thought to myself, geez, I think this has more in common with these mahals they constructed in Vellore Fort than the actual zananas in Srirangapatna. That the British were building something which they thought was appropriate, but you know
Yeah.
they were following a model which you know existed in Europe,
Yeah.
not the model that was used in South Asia.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, if you can go through some of those questions. One of them was, does she mention about the collections at the Powys Castle itself? It has some fabulous Tanjavur paintings and some bronzes and so on. Does she mention them at all?
No, let's see, the museum in Powys Castle, I believe, was set up in, when was it? Well, it's in the early 19th century. It's after she goes back
Right.
to Wales. So she goes back to Britain well, when her brother dies in 1801. She
Right.
doesn't stay that much longer after her tour. She never gets to enjoy this garden house in Triplicane she's demanded be constructed for her and her daughters.
Right.
I mean, she heads back to Britain because, of course, her sons, they're actually just little boys themselves. And so she has a lot to sort out back home.
Apparently, Powys Castle has his tent too.
Yes,
And
Ticker's
there is a
tent.
question
Yes.
as to where was the tent? Where would the tent have been in the palace?
Yes. Well, I've seen I don't know if it's the same tent, but I have seen a map of Srirangapatna, and on it it indicates an area where a tent was, which is actually outside of the palace grounds. But I don't know if it was that tent. It could have been any tent. Who knows?
Right. There's also another comment, interesting comment. We started the talk about the tiger, and when my wife, that is the curator's daughter, she visited the V&A early, say, what, a century ago. It wasn't on display. You had to specifically request to be shown and had to go through a process to be shown the tiger. Otherwise, you can't see. It is not normally on display. Is it normally on display now?
It is. It's been on display for, oh, I don't know, maybe 15 years. But I think it's going to be taken off display again quite soon because they're redesigning their South Asia galleries. So I'm not quite sure what's going to happen with it. There is, if you look on the V&A's website, there's a video you can watch which shows it in operation.
Oh,
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
that
Yeah,
music
I mean,
box, you mean?
yes, the music box and the thing sort of moving as well with the tiger lunging like
Oh.
this. Yeah. And I know that in East India House, the first location where it was in London, it was placed just adjacent to the library's reading room in East India House, and they had to. There's a crank. There's a little crank on the side that you use to wind it up and make it play, and the curators had to hide the crank because it just kept scaring the bejeebas out of all the readers in the reading room. People were always winding it up, and it was making this horrible groaning noise, and yeah.
How did the other women of, you mentioned about Lady Helena Oakley, and how did the other elite mem sahibs view Henrietta's descriptions and accounts and journeys? Were they suspicious, or were they kind of frowning down upon, or were they kind of enthusiastic about it?
I don't know. I mean, all I really got is Henrietta's side of the story, but it does sound as if there were women at Madras, European women at Madras, who were they kind of commandeered this social scene, and then Henrietta shows up with her, all her fine clothing and her two pretty young daughters, and it maybe was a little bit irksome to the others. Um, this new arrival. I've found some accounts of Lady Helena Oakley that relate to when the two sons of Tipu were hostages after the Third Mysore War in 1792-93. And Lady Oakley shows up in those accounts, and she's organizing concerts in St. Mary's Church and trying to get these poor little boys to sit still during these choral concerts. And she hosts a fancy dress party. And of course, the two sons of Tipu Sultan just show up as themselves. They're being treated kind of like pets by her.
There is another question by one of our previous speakers. Has Dr. House also looked at Emily Eden and Mary Freer, two names which completely don't ring a bell?
Yeah, I'm familiar with Emily Eden. I guess she, I believe, was traveling for much further north. I'm really interested in Tipu Sultan's court, so I've been focusing on Henrietta. I also, understandably, I focus on material that's in the UK, and this is what we have that relates to Tipu's court. Yeah, or one of the things.
And these letters that Henrietta wrote, who is she writing to?
She's writing to her mother-in-law, her brother, various friends. There are a lot of letters to her brother. She's writing to him all the time because she's really impatient to get news of her two young sons who she's left behind, and it appears that her brother is not a very good letter writer. So a lot of her letters to him begin with, "Why haven't you written to me?"
Right. Now, does she talk about the people's ideas or opinions? Does she engage in conversations and record them, or is it all observational the way she sees it?
Well, I suppose I've been focusing on the observational side of things, but yeah, I mean she'll talk about small matters back home, and ask questions about family.
No. I don't mean about her family when she travels. She talks about her travel. Does she talk to the natives and find out from them and then record the conversation or whatever? Any attempts at such interactions?
Not really. There's one incident when she's nearing Bangalore where she talks about there's some kind of commotion. I think the local people are unhappy about her and her group being there, and so she talks a little bit about that. But she doesn't. I suppose she doesn't really pay that much attention to what. Yeah, she doesn't pay that much. She regards local people as a bit superstitious and perhaps not to be taken seriously. Although she does recognize that they've been through this terrible thing, and as I mentioned, she also recognizes that the reason why these people are so suspicious of foreigners is because foreigners have been going to their villages and beating them up and stealing from them.
Yeah, I had a small question to ask. First of all, if she wrote to her brother, mother, friends, and everything, how come this collection of letters has been preserved so well and put together? I mean, none of it was lost. They have all kept together so well.
Yeah, I mean, they're not kept together that well. I think that Nancy Shields, the woman who wrote this Birds of Passage book, she did a really good job of going through all the letters. They're they're organized a little bit chaotically. I need to look at them again. I've been relying mainly on the book to get to the letters themselves. You have to go to Aberystwyth, which is sort of funny little corner in the top left side of Wales. Yeah.
Another question I had was, what really was Henrietta's main intent in undertaking this travel? What is it that she wanted to do? Just escape boredom, or did she really want to see what Tipu's country was like after he was no more?
She was an enthusiastic amateur botanist. And one of the things she writes about quite a lot is roses. She's obsessed with roses. She wants to see gardens. She's collecting seeds. Yeah, she's interested in gardens and gardening and botany. I'd say that's her main interest.
Another thing was, did she also maintain any journals and diaries, or all her observations are only letters?
It's letters, yeah.
Only letters. Okay.
Oh, lovely. I think that's about brings no further questions, Gauri.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Then I think we can call it a day with this, and it was a delightful talk and gave a lot of perspective to a lone woman traveler amongst all these men, as he pointed out.
Not quite lone, but yes.
In our series of talks, the lone traveler, and also one who concentrated mainly on women in her observations, because like most of the other, as he said correctly, when men were traveling, they were taken up by other issues like trade and what the sort of goods and the economics and politics, whereas here's a person who concentrated on women, their society, and what they were feeling, etc. So that way it makes it very unique and gives it a free perspective. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was really nice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Goodbye.
Yeah, goodbye. Just 1 minute. Yeah, we had 2 wonderful lectures today, and thanks to all of you who remained logged in and listened to them. For all those who missed the talk today or any of the previous 4 days, links to these talks are available at our YouTube channel. You can watch them at leisure. Tomorrow is the last day of our Anthology Festival, and as of now, we have only 1 talk scheduled at 5:30 p.m. English Travelers to India, From Discovery to Dominance by Dr. Pramod K. Nair. Keeping our fingers crossed, in case Dr. Chitra Madhavan feels better, she may give the concluding talk, which we missed out on yesterday. So, thanks to all of you. Hoping to see you tomorrow. Good night.